Welcome, everyone. Have you ever wondered how clinical psychologists actually figure out what's going on inside someone's mind? It's honestly a lot like high-level detective work, where no single clue, and definitely no single test, can solve the profound mystery of the human mind all on its own. So, welcome to today's Explainer. We are going to dive deep into the Clinical Detective's Toolkit. My goal today is to teach you the ropes, kind of like a masterclass in psychological assessment, so you can see exactly how professionals turn complex human behaviors into actionable, life-saving data. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's look at our masterclass syllabus. We're going to cover the assessment puzzle, the evolution of clinical tools, objective measures, the projective hypothesis, ethics and culture, and then we'll tie it all together with the real-world case of Melissa.
First up, Part 1, the assessment puzzle, more than just a score. We need to start our lesson by completely debunking a super common pop psychology myth right out of the gate.
You see, there's this idea that a single psychological test tells the whole story of who you are. But we really have to draw a sharp, fundamental contrast between psychological testing and psychological assessment. Psychological testing is actually pretty narrow. It's just assigning a score to a specific sample of behavior and comparing it to others. You take a quiz, you get a number. But psychological assessment, that is an entirely different beast. It's this iterative, highly complex decision-making process. Assessment actually requires the psychologist to systematically collect and integrate all sorts of data sources. We're talking clinical interviews, life records, tests, and environmental observations into one coherent clinical picture. So a test just gives you a metric, but an assessment, that's what helps you understand the whole person within their unique life context.
Moving on to Part 2, the evolution of clinical tools, a brief history. Because to really master how we teach and use these tools today, we have to look back at how they were forged in the first place. The evolution of assessment is basically the history of clinical psychology itself.
This timeline perfectly maps our shifting scientific understanding of the human brain. We start way back in 1899 with Emil Kraepelin's early diagnostic system, and then move to the Binet-Simon intelligence scale in 1905. By the 1920s, heavily influenced by psychoanalytic theory, we see tools emerge like the famous Rorschach inkblot test. But then notice this massive pivot in 1943. The publication of the MMPI shifted the whole field dramatically toward empirical, data-driven approaches. And finally, by the late 1960s, Walter Mischel's person-situation debate challenged the idea of stable traits entirely, which gave rise to the modern behavioral assessments we see today.
That brings us perfectly to Part 3, objective self-report measures, the data-driven approach. Let's dig into the most common, robust tools in the modern psychologist's toolkit. Let's define exactly what we're talking about here. Self-report measures, which you'll often hear referred to as objective personality tests, are highly structured instruments. They use set response options. Think of your standard true or false questions or simple rating scales where individuals directly describe their own behavior, thoughts, or emotions. Because they're so structured, these tools rely on computerized, objective scoring. And that makes them incredibly reliable, highly cost-effective, and super easy to compare against large, representative normative groups. Basically, the math does all the heavy lifting. Now, these are the real heavy hitters of clinical practice, and they generally fall into two main categories: broadband inventories and brief checklists. On the broadband side, you've got these massive 500-plus item tests like the MMPI-2 for adults, or the MCMI-4, which focuses on personality disorders. The PAI and the NEO-PI-3 are also extremely popular for mapping DSM diagnoses and standard personality traits. Then, on the totally opposite end of the spectrum, you have brief checklists. Take the BDI-2, for example. It's just 21 items, and it's used weekly to monitor very specific symptoms like depression.
But since my goal is to teach you the realities of this field today, I have to ask, have you ever taken a personality quiz and been tempted to answer in a way that makes you look, just a little bit better than you actually are? Come on, we all have. Well, in clinical settings, this is known as fake good bias, where test takers intentionally try to appear highly resilient. And on the flip side, some individuals might fake bad or malinger because they're seeking compensation or immediate help. To counter this, modern objective tests are incredibly clever. They feature these built-in validity scales that are specifically designed to catch inconsistent or dishonest responding. You really, truly can't easily trick the math on these inventories.
All right, Section 4, the projective hypothesis, accessing the unconscious. We're going to shift gears now and take a completely impartial look at a very different and sometimes controversial paradigm of psychological measurement.
The projective hypothesis operates on a pretty fascinating psychoanalytic assumption. The idea is that when individuals try to make sense of ambiguous stimuli, like a random ink blot for instance, their unique interpretations will reveal their underlying unconscious needs, emotions, and hidden personality structures. Now, unlike those highly structured objective tests we just talked about, these tasks are unstructured. Administration usually involves two steps. First, there's a response phase, where the client just freely says what they see. Then there's an inquiry phase, where the examiner clarifies exactly what parts of the stimulus the client used to form that image. Because there are absolutely no true or false answer keys here, interpretation requires highly idiographic, meaning deeply individualized, clinical judgment.
This brilliantly illustrates the sheer variety of ways clinicians historically tried to bypass a client's ability to fake their responses. Proponents argue that because the purpose of these tests is disguised, clients just can't easily manipulate them. There are 5 main types of projective techniques we look at. Association, like the famous Rorschach ink blot test. Construction, like the thematic apperception test or TAT, where clients tell elaborate stories about ambiguous black and white pictures. Then there's completion, which uses unfinished sentence stems. Arrangement or selection, often using color tests. And finally, expression, like the draw person or house tree person tests, where clinicians interpret symbolic features of a client's artwork. For example, they might interpret a drawing with a really large head as representing a strong fantasy life.
So how do these two distinct paradigms actually stack up against each other? Let's neutrally compare them based purely on the clinical data. On the left side of our table, self-report measures boast strong internal consistency and test-retest reliability, and they're supported by extensive validity data across thousands of studies. Their interpretation is objective and computerized. On the right side, while proponents really value projective measures for accessing unconscious tendencies, critics point out some severe scientific flaws. They frequently suffer from poor reliability and validity. Notably, Rorschach norms often over-pathologize normal individuals, erroneously labeling healthy people as having significant cognitive impairments. Plus, because practitioners sometimes fail to use standardized scoring systems, interpretation is highly prone to what's called illusory correlations. That's the mistaken belief that specific test responses always reliably link to certain symptoms. Just to highlight how stark this contrast is, consider this stunningly low correlation number, 0.08. Research shows that Rorschach variables correlate incredibly weakly with self-report measures of the exact same psychological constructs, coming in at an R value of just 0.08. Furthermore, the test cannot consistently detect most psychiatric diagnoses. This really cements exactly why, in modern evidence-based practice, self-report measures are generally considered to be psychometrically much stronger.
Let's move on to Section 5, Ethics, Culture, and Validity. Because teaching you about the tools is really only half of our class today, we also absolutely need to understand the practical nuances and ethical boundaries that every clinical psychologist has to navigate.
Here is a critical ethical distinction every practitioner must respect regarding evidence-based assessment. There is a strict, undeniable wall between test data and test material. Test data refers to the client's actual scores and results. This ultimately belongs to the client and may be released to them provided there's truly informed consent regarding the purpose and limits of confidentiality. But test material? That refers to the publisher's manuals and the actual test stimuli themselves. These absolutely must remain completely secure. If test materials leak to the general public, it compromises the validity of the test for everyone in the future.
Furthermore, we have to talk about cultural relevance. Many of the objective inventories we discussed earlier were historically standardized on white, middle-class norms. Applying these rigidly across different cultures can really disadvantage or over-pathologize ethnic minorities. The takeaway here is simple. Culturally responsive assessment isn't just a nice idea, it's a practical necessity. It requires deep self-awareness, the rigorous use of measures that are validated specifically for the client's demographic group, and a collaborative approach where the client and therapist jointly define the problem to ensure the results are actually accurate.
All right, Section 6, the case of Melissa, bringing it all together. Let's ground all of this heavy theory in a highly practical human context.
Let's see how all this builds a complete, actionable picture. Imagine a real-world scenario. A woman named Melissa presents with severe postpartum anxiety and OCD. How does the clinical detective solve this using everything we've learned? Well, step 1, a thorough clinical interview directly with Melissa. Step 2, a spouse interview with her husband Eric to gather external context.
Step 3, having Melissa engage in daily self-monitoring of her anxiety episodes to gather real-time behavioral data. And Step 4, administering standardized self-report measures. The psychologist uses the MMPI-2 validity scales to verify that Melissa's responses are forthright, uses the Y-Box-2 to map her specific OCD symptoms, and the BDI-2 to check for depression. By iteratively integrating all these varied data points, the clinician uncovers her high levels of rumination and obsessiveness and ultimately designs a highly effective, evidence-based exposure and response prevention therapy plan.
Which brings us nicely to the core thesis of our explainer today, captured perfectly in this quote from our source material. Integrating diverse assessment data is a complex task, requiring the same scientific thinking used to interpret research. True clinical utility requires balancing those standard training tools, whether self-report or projective, with psychometrically sound data. That's how we actually enhance patient care and improve success rates.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today in our masterclass on psychological assessment. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Can a standardized test ever truly capture the whole complexities of a human person? It's something deeply fascinating to reflect on as you consider the vast, intricate mystery of your own mind. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.